Hello, welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today I'm with Nell Shamrell-Harrington. Is that right?
Nell Shamrell-Harrington, but it's okay.
Shamrell-Harrington.
Yeah. It's very close to Shamrock. Yeah.
Yeah, Nell Shamrell-Harrington.
You got it.
So long name. You did abbreviate it to Nell on here, so maybe Nell is okay.
My full name was too long for the I tried putting in for the field where you enter your name on the recording thing.
Yeah, I have a friend who's Dutch, and it takes him forever to fly in and out of China because, they're not recognized, Marinus, Gafridis, you have to have a Christian name, a last name that's 3 letters or 3 words. Anyways, so I understand. So you're still running This Week in Rust. You're also a Rust Foundation board member, I believe.
That's correct.
For Microsoft. Yep. And yeah, you're kind of an OG in the community, I guess we could say. You've been around for a long time, since really early days.
It's kind of early days. I've been around since 2016 is when I first started using Rust, which in COVID time, that seems like a lifetime ago. But it was around then. I was working on the Habitat project at Chef's Software.
So maybe before I butcher your whole employment or involvement history, maybe I'll let you kind of talk about that. Why don't you go ahead and do a quick introduction and we can kind of start, from your past and work up to now. Go ahead.
Certainly. Well, we're going a little far back. I actually majored in theater in college, and I did computer science courses on the side. In the pre-show, we talked a little bit. I went to a very good but pretty brutal prep school for high school. I got to college all the intellectual capacity that I needed, but what I was missing was emotional intelligence and even just being functional emotionally. I couldn't understand my own emotional reactions to things, let alone other people's emotional reactions to them. So I think that's why I was so drawn to theater, was it taught me that, among other things, 2 people can have different reactions to the same thing and neither one is right or wrong. And that has been enormously helpful in software development and in designing things that are going to be used by users, whether that user is a highly technical person or a less technical focused person. Just because one of them has a different reaction to something I create doesn't mean it's right or wrong. So after college, I worked at the University of Washington for a while, then eventually moved into the startup world. I did 3 startups in a row over 9 years, which was a lot. I was at Blue Box, which was a cloud infrastructure company, then FishMe, which was a cybersecurity company, and then Chef Software. And Chef is where I started using Rust. I was working on the Habitat project, which was a distributed systems project written in Rust. Love the language, love the community. I love how warm the community is and how welcoming it is to newcomers. I was writing something today and I said, in the Rust community, no one calls you a noob, which might show a bit of my age. That's a term kind of from the earlier days of the internet, but it's true. Then I was at Mozilla working on the Rust language full time, working on the infrastructure team, doing a little bit of work with the async working group. Also, that's where I started as lead editor of This Week in Rust. And I unfortunately was hit by the Mozilla layoffs in August of 2020 when 25% of the company was cut, including most of the Rust developers. And that was not a fun thing to go through, but it meant I was available when the call from Microsoft came and have been at Microsoft since then. Initially working on a project around open source licenses. Now I'm in the Azure office of the CTO focused on supply chain security when it comes to open source software and writing day-to-day Rust, which I absolutely love. So I still do This Week in Rust in my free time. I still, dabble in following what other working groups are doing. I did some Rust tutorials, which were on YouTube. Like the language, I really like the community, and I'm so, so happy to be a part of it.
There's so much juicy material I wanted to sideway on when you went through all that. Like, for one, I like that you have the mindset of, there's no kind of right or wrong kind of thing. That's huge. I think that definitely changed my personality. Also kind of made me have gray hair in a shorter time, in a longer time. Because, it's stressful when you're like, oh, no, this is so wrong. But if you take a look and say, okay, can you tell me what was your side? And then you're like, okay, I can see that. That is very helpful. And I wish more people would have that kind of mindset. I didn't think theater would bring that. Is that right? You said the theater brought this?
Very
The
much.
EQ? Wow.
Well, the example I use from theater is, most people know Romeo and Juliet, one of Shakespeare's works. And at the very end, let's say you have a mother and her 13-year-old daughter sitting next to each other. End of Romeo and Juliet, they're both going to be crying, but it's for different reasons because they're at different stages in their life. They have different experiences. And it can be people at different stages of their careers. When it comes to software and technology, they're going to have different reactions. Or, coming from different backgrounds. I mean, Rust is very, very multinational, which are multi-continental, which is fantastic. There's communities in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. We feature the Rust Nigeria newsletter from time to time in This Week in Rust. And we're all going to have different reactions to things. This often comes out when we're working on RFCs in the Rust community. In that, I think the reason that process works as well as it does, even though it can be frustratingly slow, is that no one can keep all the context of the Rust ecosystem, let alone how anyone interacts with the Rust ecosystem in their head. You put a proposal out, you get a lot of comments on it, and from that, more context starts to emerge, and we often have a much better design of whether it's a feature, whether it's a new team within the Rust community. We come up with a much better design than anyone could have on their own, or even any one team could have come up with. It takes the whole community to design Rust to work as well as it does.
Yeah, I can imagine how much, especially with kind of when you're using a language that's not your first, and there's a lot of this kind of, what do you call that? Yeah, not understanding the cultures of certain things, right? I run into that all the time. And I'm so happy that I work with a German guy who he actually knows that I'm just a very much a matter of fact. And like he's like, yeah, the first time I talked to you, I felt like, oh my God, did I make this guy angry? No, I'm just very blunt, A, B kind of thing rather than a gray, wearing black and white usually.
Right. I
That's
grew
a
up with
huge
two
thing.
parents in the military, and the bluntness, which I have as well, I think their directness, I would say, definitely comes from that.
I think I'm blunt and direct. So sometimes it's like, this code sucks. Rather
Yeah.
than just saying, yeah, RFCs. Yeah, when you write your RFCs, I mean, they're very tricky, right? Because everybody has an opinion.
Of
And
course.
actually, I can also imagine, like, yeah, I mean, how do you handle like differing opinions where nobody's willing to kind of back down or compromise or anything? Like, how do people actually handle this kind of stuff?
I mean, it's rare in the Rust community for it to get to the point where there cannot be agreement. That has happened. In one case, I know the core team, I think this was around async, the core team brought in an external mediator or acted as a mediator. I can't quite remember which one it is, in order to help break the deadlock in that. You know, when I've done RFCs, like I did the async streaming, which I think is called Async Iterators now, RFC, lots and lots of different opinions, lots and lots of different comments. Towards the end, when it was getting very close to final comment period, someone came in and said, well, this doesn't work for this thing, so you need to change everything, and this is how you need to change it. And I responded to some of their comments, but eventually I said, I appreciate your input very much. I understand this may affect you, or this could potentially affect you, because we were unable to confirm on that. I am going to keep the design as it is because we've put so much work into it and we've got broad consensus on it. However, once this is implemented, once it is launched, if you see issues, please consider opening another RFC or please considering reaching out in GitHub issues. So the key part is that is enough for most people, is to make them feel heard, and you'll be real about it because people will sense from a mile away if you're not being genuine on that. And that is enough for most people. But on very, very rare occasions, it helps to bring in, and even if it's not external to the Rust project, but a person who's not directly involved in the debate to facilitate discussion around it.
Yeah. I can also imagine from their side, they're like, they still can feel maybe they're just not listening to me or
Right.
whatever. But
And you do the best you can and do it in writing. And nice thing about the RFCs is they are public. Most people will at least feel heard. There are some people who won't. So it's important to gently but firmly set a boundary. And there does come a point where a decision needs to be made, even if it's not the decision that a few people might want. You go generally with a general consensus rather than letting it be upended by one person's opinion. You still respect that opinion, you still treat them decently, you still listen to them, but it's a skill that it took me a long time to learn, but to gently push something forward, even if there may be someone who's loudly objecting to it. Once you establish that they've been heard, you've responded, I understand your reasons, these are the reasons we're doing it this way. we do need to move forward with this.
What do you know? What was the outcome of that? Did they come back with a new RFC, or did they just say, "Okay, thank you for making me feel heard"? Or
I think it was a long time ago. I don't remember if it came to a new RFC, but the RFC was adopted and async was obviously implemented in Rust.
okay, I was just kind of curious about what that person did, because I can imagine some people just kind of giving up, or you do see sometimes these people who they still feel, well, they still don't understand that this is a problem, and they just say, "Okay, I'm out of this community." I've seen some discussions like that, and that's just disheartening.
It is disheartening, and it's heartbreaking when it happens, but sometimes people need to walk away for a while to cool off. And then sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. But again, it's keeping the overall big picture in mind, which is we want to improve the Rust language for as many people as possible. We want to do it in a way that people can feel heard, and we want a coherent design at the end of the day, I think is what it comes to. Design by committee doesn't work. Design by committee, everything's kind of mediocre, I would say, or if it's, if the design is upheld by committee, you do eventually have to make the decision. In RFCs, that's usually the team or the team lead. I think it's more the team that is closest to that part of the Rust language or closest to that part of the Rust community.
Yeah, actually, maybe we can kind of talk about that for a second,
Sure.
because I don't know if a lot of people actually know how RFCs work. Because, like, if I want to make a change to the language, I think they could make it better or whatever. I mean, that sounds very. And when you say RFC, it sounds like, oh my god, I have to fill out a form, attach
Right.
the
Sounds
paperwork. I
very
mean,
formal. Yep.
but it's not so formal, right? I think it could be a Markdown file, or it's a GitHub
Oh, it
issue.
is
I
a
forgot
Markdown
what
file. Yep.
it is. A
And there's a
Markdown file. That's
template.
what I thought.
Yeah. Generally, what I advise people to do is if you have an idea for the language, that's great to bring it forward. Talk to the team that's closest to that area first. That can be jumping into their Zulip channel or their Discord channel, because I think some teams use Zulip, some teams use Discord. Opening GitHub issue. I've seen forum posts on the Rust internals forum say, I have this idea. This is what I'm thinking. I'm thinking about opening an RFC for this. Is there anything I should be aware of before then? Because it might be that there's already an RFC open for that, or there was an RFC that has not been resolved because a consensus could not be come to. So that allows the teams with the context to give you some of that context. And then for the compiler, I believe the next step, and they have this all documented quite well with examples, is a major change proposal, which is not the same as all teams do. Some teams do a pre-RFC. When you start to put together in the RFC format, but you're not officially submitting it, you're just working with the team associated with that area of the language to make sure you've got the context correct, see if there's any things that they obviously notice right off the bat that you need to change. And then you file it as a pull request in the, I think it's github.com/rustlang with a hyphen/RFCs. And that's when it's open to the entire community. So there's several steps along the way. It's a scary process. We've had employees at Microsoft, and this is public, who have filed RFCs, and I've worked with them either before they submit it to say, okay, this is stuff that's going to come up. This part could be a little clearer. Let's work through it. And then they submit it and sometimes guide them a little bit on, okay, it looks like discussion has petered off. There hasn't been a decision made, but obviously we want a decision to be made. Let's see how we can address any lingering comments and get the discussion flowing again. So it's not a scientific process, I guess I would say. I mean, there are formal steps in it, but it ultimately is a social process for making a technical decision, which is a very difficult thing to do. We've seen that, blow up some communities over the years, but we're doing it in the best way that we can. And we have iterated on the process throughout it when we discovered new ways to do it, or discovered some aspect of it wasn't serving the way it used to.
Now, when you say social, you're starting to make me think about politics in the U.S., where you have a whip that's going to come out there and say, "Come on, you got to vote on this, or I'm going to."
No.
It's not like that when you say social,
Yeah.
right? Because, like, when I think about RFC and I think about Rust, like, I want to have a technical, sound, fact-based, say, this is good because
Right.
X, Y, Z. But you said social. What does that mean?
By social, I mean you have to have that discussion with other people. That's
Okay.
what I mean by social. Yeah. Does politics ever come into it? Yes. It's a community of people. Wherever there are people, there's going to be some politics, but having those discussions publicly helps quite a bit. And showing that there's a sound basis to make each decision also helps quite a bit. I know, when I was at Chef, we ran a community package repository site called Supermarket. And many, many, many times people would either ask us, why is there not namespacing, or why don't you add it? It's just a string in the database. And the answer was no, there's a lot more involved in that. And I know that's come up with crates.io, where people have opened RFCs saying, hey, let's add namespacing. And there's very good reasons why there's not namespacing on crates.io, and reasons where namespaces wouldn't necessarily solve the problems people think they're going to solve. But those reasons are documented. So when it inevitably comes up again, you can point people to previous RFCs and show this was not adopted. This was the reasoning behind it. This is the context you need to understand before considering proposing this again.
Oh, yeah. I've heard that argument a lot. People saying, oh, yeah, we need to add native spacing because people are going to get fished with crates and this and that. And I'm surprised. Yeah, I haven't heard anybody ever talk about the RFC for that, but I can imagine, now that you mentioned it, yeah, there should have, somebody must have officially proposed it.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's come up many, many times. But there are legitimate, sound technical reasons for not adding it in, or not adding it in retroactively, which we can go into if you wish, but that's a longer conversation, I think, than we have time for today.
Yeah, indeed. I just remember there's that recent vulnerability in the decimal crate or something like that came out.
Yes.
That's very scary. But I guess people say, oh, you see, we should have this because this kind of thing. It's like, well,
it's not going to prevent that kind of thing from happening.
Yeah.
I can tell you that. So open source supply chain security is my job at this point. Typo squatting is something that happens a lot, where even if the namespace is reserved, I think we saw this on NPM recently, people type it in a way where it's just slightly off, but it's something that could be auto-filled in, or someone could not notice that it was a typo dependency that had been added in rather than the official dependency. Namespaces aren't going to prevent that, unfortunately. So again, it's the merging of the technical part with the people part, which the most difficult thing to understand and to work in, but it's also the most high impact thing you could possibly do, is understanding how the people part and the technical part work together.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, but why don't we talk a little bit more about, okay, so you were working at Chef, right?
Yeah.
I'm surprised you're not saying, oh, I really love using Ruby, because Chef was always known for the cookbooks, right? If I remember the same Chef.
It was, I almost said Ruby. So it was originally written in Ruby, and then it was translated to Erlang, and then parts of it were translated to Go, but the project I was working on, Habitat, was a brand new project, and we wrote that in Rust from the beginning.
So when you were working at Chef, you were strictly on Rust? You didn't do anything else?
I did do Ruby as well in my first year or two there, but then I switched over to Habitat, and I was working in Rust, developing in Rust, yes.
So how was the switch from Ruby to Rust?
Rust has a higher learning curve, I think, regardless of what background you come from, than expected. I didn't find it that bad. In part, a lot of people, at least at that time, a lot of people in leadership in the Rust community, like Steve Klobnik, like Sage Griffin and others, they came from the Ruby community. So there was some shared context in how the community worked and what the general expectations were. It was not an insurmountable mountain by any means. It's a higher learning curve than I think, switching from Ruby to Python would be, but it was not impossible. I think it was well worth it. I did appreciate systems programming in a way I never had when I was doing Ruby, once I learned Rust.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of weird that you mentioned this. I felt, because I was in a Ruby community too, and it felt like one day I wasn't doing podcasting, right? So maybe I had no idea who I was, which is fine. But how do I say this? It felt like one day everybody was like, you know what? The performance of Ruby is so bad. I'm changing to Go, or I'm changing to, I don't think Rust was even in my radar, but I'm changing to Elixir because of Jose Valim. I'm changing to whatever. It felt like everybody was just splintering off, but a lot of people were going over to Go. So it's quite interesting. I think it must be around the same time. I don't know what happened. It's like a max exodus of Ruby's too slow. I'm going to something more performant.
I think switch to distributed systems, or the emergence of distributed systems, that's part of what motivated a lot of that change. I don't have evidence for that. I am supposing that based on my own experience, but I think that was at least in part of the motivation there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think also that was also around the time when multi-core was kind of coming out, and everybody was talking about threading and how to handle concurrency. And Ruby just wasn't really doing that kind of stuff at the moment.
So it was kind of, but it was still early, and I think it didn't have the really high performance that people were looking for.
I think the only thing you could really do was Reactor, from what I remember. It's been a while since I looked at it.
Now they have something for me too, so I can't remember.
Now they have something similar with green threads and stuff being built into the language, if I remember, with the new version. But I just remember Reactor, and then lots of issues with multi-core and stuff, and everybody was like, "All right, I'm done." Okay. So you fell in love with the language, and then you obviously went to Mozilla, right? So this is right after
Yep,
Chef, you went to Mozilla?
I did. So I was doing a lot of work along with my Rust development work. I was also doing a lot of work on open source governance when I was at Chef because Chef made a decision, I think it was in 2018. I think that was when we announced it. No, it was 2019 is when we announced it to open source almost all of its products, or at least the code for its products, rather than having some of it be open source, some of it be held behind closed doors. And I think it was about 80 engineers who my boss, who was then CTO, Corey Scobie, said to me, you need to figure out a way to teach them how to be engineers in an open source context, the technical parts as well as the communication parts. Please do that. And I said, okay. So part of that was a very long effort to establish, we call it the Chef Book of open source, good open source practices, also the technical tools and such and the ways you could develop that would facilitate that. And that work, I got the attention of some people. I think it was Nico Matsoukas and Aaron Turon. I got their attention. They reached out on me in Twitter because Rust at that point was putting together a Rust working group or a governance working group. And they said, could you please come and help us with that? And that's how I got, involved with some of the Rust leadership. And then Nico reached out to me when it opened on the Rust team at Mozilla and said, can you please apply for this? And I applied. I went through the interviews, everything else, and I was hired on there.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that's really, how do I say that? Kind of goes back to like, if you're doing what you're doing and you're doing a good job and you're really into it, then people will notice that and try to help you, or I'm not sure what the right wording would be.
Notice that, and you do have to, it helps if you present it at conferences or you talk about it on Twitter or other places people gather. I had been speaking at Rust conferences prior to that in my role at Chef. And then if you communicate what you're doing well and the value of it, they see how it could provide value to their company or to their team. So I think that is the way it works, at least some of the time.
Well, I think, yeah, most of the time, right? So if
That's
you're
a good
kind of out there
point. Yep.
promoting, people will notice it and say, hey, yeah, we, as I told you before the podcast, I'm still waking up over here.
No
I
worries.
forgot what the right word is, but yeah, I just thinking about that recently. Where kind of like pick something and do something well, and people will notice and come looking for you and etc. and want to work with you, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you sometimes do have to promote yourself a little bit as part of that, but it doesn't take that much, honestly.
Okay, well, it depends. I mean, for you, it may not be much, but for other people, it's like, oh,
That's
this
a good point.
person's like, crazy about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do I say this? Okay. So you started working at Mozilla. You were doing the governance, right?
Yep.
How about after that? What were you kind of up to?
I was also doing async work and working with the infrastructure team, which ran the crates.io infrastructure and other cloud resources used by the project. Then, as I mentioned, I unfortunately did get caught up in the layoffs from Mozilla in August of 2020, but that meant I was available when Microsoft called. And I always knew I wanted to be involved in Rust at Microsoft, even though I wasn't writing Rust in my day to day work initially. But around that time, Microsoft joined the Rust Foundation. And my boss, who was fantastic, put me forward as someone who would be good to be Microsoft's representative on the Rust Foundation board. So I've been doing that since I think it was February or so of last year. And I'm learning a lot interacting with the other members of the board. Well, the project members, most of them I knew, and I've been interacting with them quite a bit beforehand. But we have a representative from Google, we have a representative from AWS, we have representatives from lots of different companies. And corporate cultures are very, very different. Microsoft's culture, very different from Amazon's, which is very different from Google's, very different from Facebook/Meta. And it's been interesting to see we're all using the same technology, we're all using Rust, but the way we're used to communicating is very different. The way we're used to working together is very different. So I've learned a lot about that in my time on the foundation board.
Yeah, actually, do you mind to talk about kind of what actually happens? Because to me, it's like the Illuminati kind of choosing what happens with the rest. I know it's not that, but it's
Yeah.
kind of like a mystery. It's like,
So
well, they
the
have this Rust
foundation,
Foundation. We don't know what they're doing.
they are completely separate from the project.
Yeah,
Technical
exactly.
decision making remains with the project. It was set up, kind of a separation of powers, if you will, in some ways, the way the US government was set up. But it is separate when it comes to the technical decision making. However, the foundation is well financed and well set up to provide resources to maintainers and resources to the project. We provide legal resources, we provide We have the three biggest clouds in the world. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. Excuse me, AWS, Microsoft, and Google. AWS is Amazon, but sometimes it's important to make the differentiation. And there's a lot of cloud infrastructure that we can provide, which we've been doing. Recently, the Rust Foundation announced it was going to be doing workstations in the cloud for contributors to Rust. So the first time I compiled the Rust compiler, it took 40 to 50 minutes every time I made a change on my even decently spec'd Dell XPS laptop. So imagining someone who's trying to contribute on Chromebook or on even a lower spec but decent laptop, it's going to be untenable to expect them to wait that long or even longer every time they need to compile things to see if they've made a change. And yes, there are ways you can optimize that, but it just by having cloud workstations, it's in alpha right now. I think it's still in the experimental stages. Having cloud workstations, but it'll be further released soon, that lowers the barrier for getting started with contributing to Rust. It lowers the technological investment that you have to do yourself in order to, or your company has to do in order to start contributing to Rust. So that's another important thing. The community grants program, which was announced, and we accepted applications. I expect an announcement around the fellows who were selected, projects, etc., will be going out in the nearish future. That's another thing the foundation does. And it's providing, sponsorships, some through, depending on where people are, the way they take the payment for that sponsorship will likely be a little different. But providing, $1,000 a month for Rust maintainers who are dedicated to working on a specific portion of Rust, whether that's maintenance, whether that's improving documentation, whether that's adding new features to the compiler, reviewing pull requests, etc., it's providing some payment at least for their work. And yes, in the US, $1,000 a month, you're not going to live on that. Other parts of the world, it might make more of an impact than in other places. And as we said before, Rust is very multinational, but it is something. It is something, some way of helping someone provide for a living while working on the Rust language and the Rust ecosystem that all of us benefit from so much. That was a very long answer, and I apologize for that. But those are the main things when people ask, what does the foundation actually do? Those are the main things that come to mind immediately.
So we're recording this episode before the episode will be released, but I've already interviewed Rebecca Rubble. Mm-hmm. And so she goes deep into the Rust Foundation, so I don't want to go too deep.
Absolutely. Yeah, Beck is fantastic.
Yeah, she is great, and she's a charm to chat with, too. And she definitely laid out more about what's going on. And so I think if anybody's interested to hear, of course, listen to that episode. But something I do want to say, and she already mentioned, I believe, in the podcast, which is actually, you're also receiving, well, This Week in Rust is receiving help from the foundation, right? I believe MailChimp is being sponsored by them, which is fantastic.
The MailChimp fees for the mailing list for This Week in Rust are being paid for by the Rust Foundation, which I greatly appreciate.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious because now there's a formal process for asking for assistance, right? Mm-hmm. What was the process like before? Because you're there, you're like, hey, I need this or something, or how would it happen?
I came to them as a community member, and I was not a part of making the decision about whether it was sponsored or not. And other community members honestly can do this too, even if you're not a part of the community grants program, saying, this is an expense that's being incurred by this resource for the Rust community. This has been paid out of pocket previously. It would be wonderful if the foundation could sponsor this amount. It's $140 or something a month, I think. If the foundation could sponsor this for the good of the Rust community. And I think because so many people read This Week in Rust, so many people have, get their careers really kicked into high gear by writing something and having it be featured in This Week in Rust. I do suspect it was a fairly straightforward decision to make on that.
Yeah, that was their exact words were like, of course. So I thought that was interesting. And $140, it's peanuts, I think, compared to other things that need financial assistance, right?
Right.
Especially
another
for
thing
the outreach. Mm-hmm.
that came to the foundation in the early days was Crates.io. Was the on-call rotation was 2 volunteers for Crates.io. They worked in shifts, obviously, but 24/7, being unpaid and being called in at all hours to fix something or to check on something with the infrastructure, that was not sustainable and it was not fair. So something the foundation also made a decision on was to hire a group of systems administrators who are very familiar with Rust, who are paid through a contract the foundation has with their employer. And those Contractors then, there's more than two of them, obviously. They are paid for their work. They develop their own on-call schedule and share the load. So that was another need in the Rust community that came to the foundation very early, and something that was an easy decision to make. Yes, we have to do this. And then we were able to put it in place.
Yeah, what I remember, the last time I heard about this with Crates.io, I think it was Ferris Systems was offering help.
And yes, a member of the Rust Foundation board is, I think, the founder of Ferris Systems. He stepped out of the discussions when we were discussing what contractor to go with. There were a few different possibilities, but Ferris ultimately was the best choice for the needs of the Rust ecosystem at that time. But yes, when something comes up involving Microsoft, I will conflict of interest myself out of it. I don't think that's actually a verb, but it can be, saying, this is my employer. I have a conflict of interest in how this funding may be decided or how this decision might be made. I'm going to step back from this. And then the rest of the board makes the decision. And I think it's very common practice in just about any board. At least it should be.
That's a good point, right? So if something came up for, say, WebAssembly, I mean, that's browser-based. That could be Microsoft. That could be Apple. I don't think Apple's on the board, if I remember correctly. That could be Google.
At the board, we wouldn't be making the technical decisions around WASM. But if someone made a funding request, then yes, we would have to look at, is there a conflict of interest in any of us?
Okay, yeah. So you have to kind of make that on your own. I'm just kind of curious, has there ever been a time where the guy most people feel there's a conflict of interest, but that representative said, no, I don't feel it. And then they would just stay there?
That has not come up.
Okay, it's good.
I hope I don't have to say yet, but that has not come up. People have been, we want to do things right by the Rust community, but also right way legally and the right way ethically. So far, that has not been an issue on the board. I can't talk about everything we talk about in board meetings, but I can say that has not been an issue so far.
Okay. Of course, I'm just kind of curious. I want to make sure that the foundation is doing the best that they can. Right. And I'm happy that you're being open about this part. And I don't know, now you make me feel a bit nervous. What are they talking about that they can't say what happens in the meetings? Now, I don't know what's going on.
Legal decisions have to be made. Those are confidential. Employment decisions, such as hiring back, the process and what was discussed, that must be confidential. And that's legally required in the US, and I think in most other countries too. I think we had a backlog due to a staffing shortage and resource shortage, minutes that had not been posted publicly. That backlog has been posted, and then minutes for any further meetings or minutes since then have been, I think, released on a fairly quick cadence after the meeting.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. Okay, I'm happy that you're able to kind of say, well, these things I cannot talk about. And then when you mention all those things, of course, it makes sense.
Right. Hiring decisions, not going to be public. Legal decisions, not going to be public. But most other things can be public. And we make the effort to be as transparent as we can be. And since we were not able to post the minutes due to resource shortage, it looked like we weren't being as transparent as we were over the past year. That has now been fixed.
Okay. Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, I feel like there's definitely a big push this year to kind of say, hey, this is who we are and this is what we're doing.
Exactly.
And I'm glad that that's finally coming out. And I'm also happy that I'm kind of a piece of that. Like I said, I brought Rebecca into the show.
Thank you for doing that.
But actually, I want to talk more about what Microsoft is doing, right? The main thing that we
Absolutely.
wanted to hear was talk about Microsoft. What is Microsoft doing? I mean, maybe we can kind of talk about the beginning. And I don't know how much you were in the beginning of this, where Microsoft started looking at Rust. Yeah, what's going on?
So things that Rust is doing, when I first came onto Microsoft, it was in the early stages of forming a Rust compiler team in our DevDiv organization. And that team works on the Rust compiler. There's a big focus on async, also has a big focus on improving debugging in Rust. Prior to something one of our employees did around adding support for debugging visualizers to the Rust language, and as far as I know, that has been merged and that has been released. The debugging experience was very, very difficult, debugging a Rust program while it was running. It was difficult on Linux, and it was even more difficult on Windows. So what he added in, his name is Ridwan Abdillahi. What he added in was a new Rust attribute that supported embedding debugger visualizers in Rust crates. Previously, you can only have those visual debugging libraries with some parts of the Rust standard library, but now it can be used with any crate, which makes when you're pulling in a crate as a dependency and something's going wrong, it gives you more visualization into that crate as well as your own code so you can figure out what's going wrong with the interaction. bringing back Ruby, it reminds me of things I would do where if something was going on with one of the gems, and I would just open up the gem, add in a put statement. Was it a put statement? Did you put things to print out lines? You did.
Yeah,
In
puts.
Ruby. Yep.
I heard puts and I heard put S. I don't know which one, which.
Yep, and then I would run my code again and see what it said. So adding a debugging visualizer makes that much, much easier. And it's a benefit to both the Windows Rust community, which there are people who develop in Rust on Windows. There are people who develop applications for Windows using Rust as well. The other big one is Arlo, who Simonson, he is another one of our engineers at Microsoft. He had been investigating Cargo's protocol to understand how it worked. We have an internal crates.io mirror within Microsoft. And he noticed that whenever someone would do some cargo command with a crate for the first time, when any dependencies were pulled in from crates.io from Cargo, Cargo would fetch a very big Git repository and pull down the whole repository, which pulled down metadata about those crates. And this takes a long time the first time. It's not so bad once you have a cache built up of things you've pulled from Cargo, but for things like a CI environment where you're doing clean builds every single time, it adds a lot of time. Additionally, using up more of GitHub's resources with all the clones and of this very big repository than they were comfortable with, so something different had to be developed. So the Cargo team and Crates.io team developed, an interim solution of, squashing Git commits more often. That has helped. Deleting branches more often. That has helped. But a long-term solution is switching from using Git to fetch the metadata to using HTTP to fetch the artifact information from some sort of storage, whether that's an S3 bucket, whether that's an Azure blob, etc. That is much faster and much more sustainable. So Arlo added in Cargo the ability to fetch from an HTTP registry along with a Git registry the way that Crates.io does. There's some limited support now. It's still in the experimental stages for adding that to Crates.io, but it is available in the nightly version of Cargo. So once that is stabilized, when that becomes widely used, that will affect the entire Rust ecosystem. It will make all of our Cargo builds much faster, and in particular make anything where you're doing clean builds where you don't have a cache much faster as well. Additionally, there is the Windows RS crate, and it's not just Microsoft who uses it. As I mentioned before, there are lots of developers who are developing Rust applications for use on Windows, and it allows Rust developers to call any Windows API, past, present, and future. And what we've found is that has also been teaching some developers. I'm sure some snarky people out there will say, well, this isn't a good idea, but it's teaching developers who have not worked with Windows APIs before how to use them in a Rust environment, which they're more comfortable with. There's a lot more I can go into. There's the Azure SDK for Rust, which is still in experimental stages. There's an RFC to add more support for fallible allocations in vectors or in other data structures. This is very important both for Rust to be able to be used by the Linux kernel. I think we all saw that announcement that said, that Rust was approved to be used in the Linux kernel. Linus Torvalds, he doesn't hate it, and that's saying a lot. So this adding in the ability to have fallible allocations is critical for both Rust support in the Linux kernel as well as Rust support in Windows. And there's also been tools written in Rust for quantum computing, tools that power GitHub's precise code nav feature. There's a lot that we're doing externally with Rust, and there's also a lot that we're doing internally with it.
Yeah, there's a lot of material here. I don't even have
I just realized I talked for quite a bit so apologies for that. But there's a lot that we're doing publicly.
Yeah, still trying to digest everything.
Yeah, we understand that the more we make Rust work well for the entire Rustacean community, the more we contribute to that, the better Rust will work for us. And yes, we have internal IP stuff that is designed to make money. That Rust working better means those work better. So part of it is being a good open source citizen. Obviously, we have to give back, but there's also a business interest in Rust working better. And I think that's true of any for-profit company that's writing software in Rust.
Now, we talked about this before the show, right? And I think it's good to make this kind of part clear. Like, is Microsoft looking to add Rust to the .NET repertoire of different languages? Or are they going to keep it kind of separate? And then, again, I mentioned before the show, do they feel like that maybe they're using it, they like it, but they don't want to overcrowd their .NET kind of portfolio or their own language portfolio? Kind of, maybe you can explain a little bit more about this part.
Certainly. So, Rust and .NET solve different problems and work well in different use cases. I don't know of any discussions of adding Rust to the .NET portfolio of languages. I would be very surprised to see that. But Microsoft is using Rust in areas where having a .NET does, in many instances, add a lot of overhead. And Rust is used in places we're willing to take the additional learning curve of Rust in exchange for lower overhead, which means faster running time. And also areas where memory safety is absolutely critical. I mean, Rust is very, very good about building in all those checks in that compiler to make sure you don't accidentally introduce a memory safety vulnerability in your code, which is quite helpful. So I would say .NET and Rust, I don't see them being competitors at all. They solve different use cases and they're more appropriate in different environments. That say, I would say, people ask me sometimes, well, is Microsoft going to rewrite all of Windows in Rust? I don't think that's going to happen, but I could see, newer parts being written in Rust or parts where there's particular memory safety vulnerabilities being rewritten in Rust and interfacing with the C++ code that makes up the majority of the Windows code base.
Yeah, I think my impression is that Microsoft is actually going to be using more of Rust than Linux, right? Linux is saying, okay, we're willing to add it in, but on the driver's side only, something that's not really critical. But I think Microsoft this is just my own kind of interpretation. I feel like they're a little bit more invested, saying, okay, for sure we have some issues, and obviously we need to make money, and 7% of their stuff could have been probably stopped by Rust. We're going to start rewriting those pieces that maybe we're not so happy with, or maybe that's really having a lot of security vulnerability parts, and saying, okay, these things we're definitely going to have in Rust, but we're still keeping stuff in C because that stuff's already battle tested, and it's just
Right.
too expensive to rewrite just for fun, basically. That would only be the only good reason,
Right.
I think.
You lose a lot of time even when you're a startup and you're rewriting, a code base that's maybe only 200,000 lines. Windows is much, much more that by a couple of factors of 10. It wouldn't be a good use of time to rewrite the entire thing in Rust. But again, moving toward, I can't speak to any specifics around this, but moving toward writing new components, rewriting parts where memory safety is absolutely critical, that I do believe there is a strong interest in doing.
Okay. Is there anything public about how much Rust is actually going into Windows, or that's kind of a secret?
I'm not aware of any public information about that at this time. I'm certain there will be at some point. I believe there will be at some point, I guess I should say.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's interested to kind of hear how do we say that? Yeah, what Rust would be doing, right? So, like, as far as I know, at least for Firefox, right? I think the CSS rendering, I think, is done with Rust, if I remember correctly.
I'm trying to remember. I think so.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting to see, like, oh, this is a very big piece of software. I mean, Firefox is no joke, right? It's not as big as it used to be.
Right.
I remember version 2 of Firefox, like, it was like, wow, this is the best thing in the world. It's like 10 times faster to render a page than IE or whatever. That was huge at the time. Now it's like, well, people still use that? Firefox is still around? It's like totally different mindset now. But I'm just kind of curious about
It's my personal web browser. I use Edge at work because there are some Microsoft internal sites that, yes, they work better on Edge than they do in Firefox, but Firefox is still my favorite browser. I have very warm feelings for it, I guess you could say, because I've used it for so long.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. But I think I stopped using Firefox almost. And now, actually, I only use Firefox for developing websites. I feel like it's still better. Like, they have that web developer edition. I feel is just better.
The developer tools I like quite a bit.
Yeah, they're doing some really interesting stuff. I think people just, I mean, yeah, you can't compete with Chromium these days. The one thing I wish they would do is make all the browsers render stuff the same. It's really annoying as a web developer.
Yeah. I
That will
remember
never
that from my
happen.
web development days with Ruby on Rails and such.
Yeah, you're what, using Safari? Who uses Safari? You just download Firefox. It's probably what was
A
your
bunch of
initial
people
thing.
do. Yeah, and a bunch of people use Chrome, a bunch of people use Firefox, people use Opera, people use other browsers. I think we were talking about a little bit in the pre-call that, in some areas of the world, different browsers are more popular than they are in other areas. And if you're going to serve that audience, you need to come to where they are, which is with the browser they're most comfortable using.
Yeah, that's the true. Before we start to kind of wrap up, though, I would like to kind of have a kind of quick chat about, is there kind of any public long-term plans for Microsoft's involvement with Rust? Are they willing to output maybe more Azure servers for maybe running CI jobs? Are they planning to expand stuff with GitHub? Anything kind of on the roadmap?
For the additional Azure resources from Azure, or Azure resources for Rust, that's something I'm working on right now.
So anything you can say, or
I think I'm working on getting. I don't know if there's anything I can say on that, unfortunately. I want to be very careful here, but
yeah,
there will be more investment by Microsoft in Rust. Well, there's a lot of investment already in the Rust Foundation, and also, again, part of being good open source citizens is volunteering our infrastructure resource, but also Microsoft has some of the best engineering product management talent in the world. It is also applying that talent to the needs of the greater Rustacean community as well.
okay, yeah. I think it's a pretty good overview. I mean, it's amazing that Microsoft is doing so much, but it just seems like nobody knows what they're doing with Rust. If you look at
We're
it,
quieter about it
yeah, definitely.
than some companies. And I know, Microsoft has a complicated history with open source, to say the least. And the approach we've taken, at least since I've been here, and I think even beforehand, is we want to show that we care about open source, that we support it, that we care about Rust through our actions, not necessarily through our words. Now, that said, I'm here using my words to talk about Rust at Microsoft, but there is a strong desire. We want to walk the walk before we talk the talk. At least that's my approach to it, and the approach that I've seen.
I think AWS has kind of come under fire for some blog posts, which I thought was very interesting.
They have a different approach. And like I said with theater, I can't say one approach is necessarily right or wrong, but again, we're different companies and our approaches are different, and that's okay.
I mean, the reason that we're actually talking is because one of your employees kind of went out to Reddit. Sorry, one of Microsoft employees went over to Reddit and made a post saying, "Hey, we got this Azure SDK. Anybody want to check it out?" I asked him to come onto the show. He felt not comfortable because I believe he's also just kind of getting into Rust himself. And he reached out and said that maybe you're a better choice.
Well, I'm very, very glad you brought me onto the show.
Yeah, actually, that's also quite interesting too, right? So now that you guys are releasing this Azure SDK, I mean, you guys are really bought into it. Right? Is there
Yeah.
more plans for more SDKs? I mean, I know WinRT was a huge one.
Right. I want to be careful to make a clarification. So Azure SDK is not officially supported by Microsoft yet. I certainly hope it will be, but it's still mainly a volunteer run effort. We're still developing it. That said, I would very much like to see Microsoft have official support for it. And I'm sure there's exploration of that going on. When that would be, I could not say at this point. But it is a very cool project. It's very, very useful, I know, to internal users at Microsoft, and it's something that I think would be beneficial to develop more on.
Yeah, definitely. I'm kind of curious if MS is going to be considering using something like Firecracker, actually using Firecracker, but having something similar, where it's got like a Rust-based OS, or that's not something they're interested in.
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Yeah.
But I think there will be much more to come.
I'm excited to see it. I wish that we could hear some more kind of public plans, but I understand it's like, well, we don't want to say this and then like it doesn't come out, right?
Right.
That just looks bad.
It does. Yep.
Now, is there anything else you want to say about Microsoft's involvement with Rust before we start to sign off?
I appreciate everyone who reaches out to me with questions, whether about Rust Foundation or whether about Rust at Microsoft. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. If I don't know the answer, I can definitely get you in contact with the person who can give you a clearer answer. And let's continue working together, whether it's through, This Week in Rust is not a Microsoft project. That's very specific, but I love working with the Rust community, collaborate on technical things. Please submit your blog posts and other things that you write to This Week in Rust. And let's continue evolving the Rust ecosystem for the benefit of all.
Well, I'm happy to say that I think you guys are consistently adding the podcast to almost every This Week in Rust, so I'm happy about that. I had no idea, to be honest. I just kind of output the episodes, and it's kind of like we call this, somebody coined the term hygienics, right? So if you brush your teeth, nobody gives you a high five, but if you forget to brush your teeth, people say, "Hey man, your mouth smells."
That's
so,
true.
Like,
I haven't heard that before, actually. And I'm the daughter of a retired dentist, so I will have to remember that.
Yeah, the reason I bring this up is because one time I chose the wrong mic, and people let me know. But other than that, it's like not to hear too much. So it's always glad to kind of hear.
A lesson I learned in open source governance, as well as any sort of management or governance, sometimes the only way you can get people to engage with something is to give them something to object to. Because when you say, "Hey, what are your ideas for this?" Sometimes there's just a lull because everyone's busy, etc. It's legitimate reasons. But when you say, "Hey, this is what I think we should do. Do you have any input on this?" Then they will engage. So, yeah, it's true.
I think that there's another method where you give people 3 choices. One is, like, so bad that, they will never choose it. One is obviously the best choice, and the other one is kind of in the middle. Is that
Mhm.
also similar too?
I think that's another approach that you could take.
Yeah, and except for sometimes when they did choose the worst one, then that's really something not unexpected, which happens.
Right.
Okay. Again, thank you so much for your time. I know you're
Thank you for
crazy busy.
having
You just
me.
moved to a new place. So sad to see an empty bookshelf behind you. I mean, you can't
I
be.
know. Well, I need to get a earthquake strap for it, or to secure
Oh,
it to the
wow.
wall, because whenever Seattle gets its next earthquake, that thing could fall and kill me if I'm right here. So
Wow.
I need to, or in fact, I actually got them. I just need to put them on. So earthquake proofing before putting the books in the bookshelves.
I didn't even know Seattle was earthquake problem. That's interesting to hear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're usually pretty small, but when we do get a big one, I think the last one was in 2001, they're big. I think it was 6.1, 6.3 on the Richter scale, something like that. It cracked the dome in the Washington Capitol, in Olympia. When we get them, we sometimes get the really big ones. So I try to be prepared.
Yeah, definitely. Better safe than sorry, right? I think it's worth it, the investment. Okay. Again, thank you for your time. And yeah, maybe we'll have you back to talk about more what's going on with Microsoft if something big happens or whatever.
Would love to. Or if you want to talk about This Week in Rust or anything else, just reach out to me anytime.
Yeah, maybe you could be a guest host on This Week in Rust sometime. It's
Oh,
around the
yeah.
same time, actually.
Yeah, I used to do a podcast for This Week in Rust, but I unfortunately didn't have time for it after I was laid off from Mozilla. So I love what the new hosts are doing with it. I love the discussion format. I'm really enjoying it. And yeah, if they ever want me as a guest panelist or guest host, just let me know.
All right, we'll take you up on that. Don't worry about that. I'll definitely hold you to that one now. Okay, thank you again.